DW Africa Link.
Zimbabwe is in trouble. People there are feeling the pinch of the Middle East conflict. The country is especially vulnerable because it imports almost all of its fuel from the Middle East. And with global oil prices increasing, well, that spells doom for many in the country. So how is it impacting lives, and what's the way out? That's what's coming up. I am Eddie Micah Jr., and you are welcome to Africa Link, the podcast connecting you to the stories that matter.
Africa Link, every weekday here on DW.
Zimbabwe's economy has long been fragile, shaped by years of hyperinflation, currency instability, and reliance on the US dollar. Fuel sits at the heart of Zimbabwe's economy, from public transport and food distribution to imports and electricity supply. So when prices rise, the impact is immediate. Transport fares jump, food prices follow, and businesses pass on the costs. And that's exactly what's happening. A conflict involving Iran, Israel, and the United States has pushed oil prices higher, and Zimbabweans are struggling to make ends meet.
The fuel issue has really affected us badly. And as a result, we're not traveling as much as we would love to. We are no longer using public transport as much as we want to because it's now expensive. So we don't commute as much as we want to. And this has really affected us. We wish our government could cushion us from all this. We know the taxes are pretty much high compared to other Southern African countries. So our appeal is that they revise the taxes so that we can also afford to commute as much as we should.
Let's get more from Chenayi Mutambasere. She's a development economist. And I also have a DW correspondent in Harare, Zimbabwe, Columbus Mavunga. Chenayi, Zimbabwe's inflation was showing some signs of stabilizing, and now there is a Middle East conflict raging. What does this mean for Zimbabwe?
The issue with Zimbabwe is uniquely a Zimbabwean issue. Whilst, of course, we're looking at the macroeconomic issues around the war, what we find is that for countries like Zimbabwe that are already vulnerable and exposed from a governance perspective, that they are likely to get a compounded effect from issues such as the Middle Eastern crisis. So by this, what I mean is, for instance, Zimbabwe has had the highest or on the higher end in terms of fuel prices within the SADC region. The reason that is because of, I guess, what we would call a vertical integration or vertical dependency. So we've got a very monopolized supply chain when it comes to fuel. So the price is determined by the fact that in terms of supply, at the very start of the supply chain, we only almost have a single supplier. So we are already at the mercy of their prices. And that is then compounded by the fact that Zimbabwe has not been liquid for many, many years. So we cannot always afford to meet our obligations, such as the export of fuel. So we are already as well are having, I think, over $2 billion debt in terms of fuel, what we owe, whether it's direct or indirectly related to fuel expenses. And so in terms of the citizens, we already have this situation where we are dependent on a single supplier, that is Trafigura. I think the latest information out of Parliament was they supply 80% of fuel in Zimbabwe. They have almost the complete control of the oil pipeline into Zimbabwe. And so when that happens, where there are then shocks that mean that this is going to be expensive for the supplier, there's no leeway for subsidy from government to ease up on the burden of rising fuel prices. These are immediately passed on to the consumers, and they are being passed on from an already high level. So this is where we are. This has really exposed the vulnerability of the country. I know we've been talking about, you mentioned previously that we've been talking about stability when it comes to inflation, but still, we're still looking at double digits that are being chipped away. Yes, at a less spiky situation. It is stable in that from that perspective, but the country is very much still vulnerable, with nearly 47% of its population currently living in extreme poverty.
You're basically describing a situation of Zimbabwe putting all its eggs in one basket when it comes to its energy needs. But also sounds like it seems there's no way out. Is Zimbabwe heading towards doom if this Middle East conflict rages on?
I would say that I think the doom card has already been played, because, as I've said, Zimbabwe has already been having very high fuel costs in the region. And as we know, there's a dependency on fuel for everything, especially because as well of the energy shortages, a lot of businesses will be running on generators that require fuel. We already have issues within our transport sector. And so these are costs that are already being passed on to consumers. So when we then have the crisis happening in the Middle East, where there is actually an increase in the global price, that is then passed on, and it makes the situation worse. But what we mustn't negate to talk about is the governance around the fuel sector in Zimbabwe that is very much controlled in a seemingly cartel-like nature, where you've got a single supplier, that is Trafigura, you have a single intermediary that is Secunda. So controlling the way fuel moves in the country, the way fuel is charged in the country. And then you find that the same are also very much connected and associated with the political elites. So this type of structure will not serve the citizens well. It is a doom card, as I said, it's already been played. Doom was already looming. But what the Middle Eastern crisis might do is actually bring that doom to an earlier date rather than some time later in the future.
Does the lifting of sanctions from some Western countries, recently we reported on that, is that likely to change anything to ease that sort of pressure on the economy right now due to the conflict in the Middle East?
There is an element of sanctions that does have a multiplier effect on economic productivity, right? Because there is a sense of risk that comes with countries that are on economic sanctions. However, saying that, Zimbabwe has never really been on any trade embargoes. We have had sanctioned individuals. And so the impact of sanctions, in my view, in my considered view, has been far less than the impact of misgovernance and the impact of corruption. Transparency International, I think, have said more than 2 years ago, said something like Zimbabwe loses a minimum of $100 million a month to corruption. And I believe that that has more impact on the economy and the stability of the economy than the lifting of any sanctions can. Because what we have to recognize is the strength of the domestic market. To what extent does the domestic market hold on to its own economic growth? To what extent are we leaking when it comes to economic growth, when it comes to liquidity? And this is where corruption comes in. And so as much as, yes, the removal of the wider sanctions is a good news story for the people of Zimbabwe, it's a good news story for our economy, because the risk perception should reduce. However, we have other situations such as corruption, such as the political risk. Zimbabwe is undergoing the constitutional amendment, which is looking to extend the term of the incumbent in terms of presidency to 2030. And when these sort of things happen, where you can, at some point in the middle of a political term, have such drastic political moves, this has an impact on investors and the way that they perceive the country. We have other things such as recently, the governor of the central bank announced that they will now be, and the Minister of Finance announced that they will now be paying all local contractors using the local currency, of which we know the local currency, and that affects businesses. And essentially what that means is, where the local contractors generally will be importing raw materials. Zimbabwe is a very much back. So you're importing your raw materials using foreign currency, but now suddenly there's an announcement that you're going to be paid in local currency, which is not easily convertible. So already there's that pressure on the economy. these are the things that affect investor confidence. They affect trust because of these policy flip-flops that happen, in the middle of the year. There's no consultation with businesses. And so even when you compound that with increasing fuel prices, it only serves to make the situation worse. This is a point of exposure rather than a new negative impact on the economy of Zimbabwe. It only seeks to expose, and is only going to bring forward the doom date, as it were, because already the country is on a very much a negative trajectory in terms of economic growth.
Columbus, it's interesting what Chennai is saying. Different factors coming together, right? Mismanagement, according to Chennai, from the government side, the monopoly of the energy sector, and then you add the Middle East conflict, all of these contributing to hardships on the ground. And when all of this is happening, it is the ordinary Zimbabwean that is suffering, right? There are reports of some commuters reacting to sudden 100% increase in transport fares, especially after the Middle East conflict started. Tell us more about how all of this is impacting the ordinary Zimbabwean, Columbus.
When these price increases were effected, workers who constitute a very small percent, but mainly informal sector is the main one, which in terms of employment. So people have resorted to walking from their homes to their workplaces, or some are asking for permission to be working from home. But when you are a teacher, when you are a nurse, or maybe you are a bread maker, you can't work from home. You have to be at the workstation, or if you're a policeman, for example. So people are now suffering. Most of them, they are saying they are now resorting to walking as they look at the prices. With the fuel, all the prices just shoot, and you are left at the mercy of the economy.
Fuel is now over $2 a liter in Zimbabwe. What does this mean for ordinary households in practical terms?
You have to cut it to 1 meal a day. If you had your children at a better school, then you have to look at worse situation. If you wanted to send yourself or your children to a hospital, you have to forget about it and hope that some divine intervention come in. So in short, it's poverty that is rising. We had seen that the official figures were indicating that poverty was decreasing, but now I think with this, unless something comes as some solution comes, whether from the West or from locally, and address the issue of the rising prices of fuel, the poverty levels are going to increase, and that comes usually with crime rate as well increasing in the society.
Right, and then you can talk about business owners. I wonder what they're telling you about how, especially these fuel hikes, are affecting their operations and prices, which of course again trickles down to the ordinary Zimbabwean, doesn't it?
Yes, the businesses were sort of not sympathizing with the government, but they were listening to what the government was saying, pleading with them, don't increase prices. But with this, they have no option. I noticed that there were two bread manufacturing companies that issued a statement that they have no choice but to increase their bread, or they have to decrease production. So that means prices are starting to going up, and that's not good for ordinary Zimbabwean and the economy generally.
Thank you, Columbus, for that. Look, let me come back to you, Chennai, because, back to one of the points that you made, Zimbabwe definitely spends a lot of money on fuel imports. Correct me if I'm wrong, but just last year, 2025, they spent almost $2 billion on fuel imports. Given that fuel is basically the economy's backbone, affecting transport, food distribution, agriculture, and manufacturing, how bad will this Middle East conflict, if it rages on, affect the country? I mean, what's the worst case scenario? Because you're already saying it's that bad. What's the worst case scenario? I mean, how much more bad can it get?
The worst case scenario is to expect an increase in terms of households not being able to afford a basic meal a day. At its worst, we've seen that go up to above 60%. And we are likely to see those numbers again. In terms of inflation, we are entering again into a season of hyperinflation, where we are looking at double digits, possibly above 20% within the next 3 months. And when we speak of inflation in Zimbabwe, we are not only looking at this from a local currency, but also from a dollar perspective. So we are looking at, and in terms of health, because we already are coming out, or we are in the season of reduced foreign aid when it comes to health, where the Zimbabwe budget has a huge reliance on foreign aid. And with foreign aid being withdrawn and not having enough within our own economy to create the reserves required to support social and healthcare needs, there's going to be an impact on health as well. Typically, Zimbabwe has been on a cycle of diseases such as cholera, nearly every year. So the risk is that for this year that increases. We see even more numbers of people being affected by diseases such as cholera because of the strain on the health budget, which will be as such because of reduced exports, because of reduced productivity as a result of increased fuel costs.
What's the way forward here? I mean, we've talked about a lot of the challenges, especially from how things are being managed from the government side. You talk about corruption in there. What's the way forward, even short to medium term, that will benefit the country in any way? What has to be done now?
So that has to really come from when you are faced with external factors that you have very little control over, such as the Middle Eastern war, it becomes even paramount that you get your own house in order, so that you're at least able to improve your gains and improve your own local reserves. So you look at example at Namibia. Namibia has got a more open sector when it comes to fuel. It's very competitive. They have more suppliers that are available to supply fuel. There's less involvement from the state. So it's more or less like a free market. We need to go back to those basics where we get less state control over economic goods. The second thing that we can do to help ourselves is to have a more assured political environment, an environment that reduces risk and improves confidence in our economy. We need to reduce things like policy flip-flops and create an environment that promotes businesses to thrive. So coming away from policy pronouncements such as change in the way that contractors are being paid, that contractors are not even involved from a consultation perspective. We really just need to get our own house in order, fix the politics, fix the governance around economic goods, so that we give ourselves a chance, because you cannot control necessarily what is happening from an external perspective.
Right. I mean, how long is that going to take? That's a whole house cleanup you're talking about. Is that realistic, short to midterm?
Certainly, some low-hanging fruit, right, can be just the way that the fuel sector is organized. There is no benefit in having a single supplier of fuel, because then you are at their mercy when it comes to prices. There is no benefit in having a single intermediary, because like you said, you're right, the politics takes time. It's a complete overhaul. This is not something that can be done in the short to medium term. But we can certainly reorganize and restructure the fuel sector. There is no reason why, for instance, we have a single supplier of fuel. There is no reason why we have a single intermediary in terms of Secunda for fuel. Just by fixing these two layers and opening them up to the market will introduce competition when it comes to fuel pricing. And this should see an immediate reduction in fuel prices. We also need to see less of the state hand involved in economic goods and the free market. So, for instance, whether it's the Reserve Bank getting involved in quasi-fiscal activity when it comes to the market, distorts the price and increases the price and reduces confidence and trust in our economy. These are low-hanging fruits. And yes, they require political will, but this is something that can be done next week. We can open up the market and introduce new suppliers of fuel to the Zimbabwean economy.
Thank you very much for that, Chinai. Columbus, you're going to have to start wrapping things up for us. We've looked at a lot of the possible solutions, however challenging they may be, but it's worth the start. Are people optimistic about how things may end up?
I think optimism for many Zimbabweans has been fading. We have been in a long war of poor economy, and this crisis, the Middle East crisis, I think has worsened that. We have developed some hope, but I think that hope is fading again. We have one of the highest price of fuel increase, and Zimbabweans are saying it's because another thing that maybe Chennai is better qualified to talk about is the taxes, levies that are on fuel. About 80 cents for every liter goes either to is tax or is a levy that goes to a government or a government department. So people on social media, they're saying, why can't the government, if it's a listening government as they claim, why can't they just quickly reduce that number to say maybe 20 cents a liter for combined levies and taxes? And then that will give citizens breathing space while the situation is being monitored in the Middle East. So that could be one of the easiest things that the government can quickly do.
Thanks very much, Columbus. Now, I have a thing where on the show, if I have a lady expert on the show, then I give them the final words, something for optimism, some light at the end of the tunnel kind of rounding up. And I will leave that to you, Chinai, to wrap this up for us.
Thank you so much. I know I am afraid I'm the lady of doom, but no, in earnest, I think the good thing with a country like Zimbabwe is it has a lot going for it in terms of its own natural resources and the Zim assets. So the fact that Zimbabwe is blessed with assets, over 40 tradable minerals, it has the land, it has the weather to support a good agriculture win. And so the opportunity for Zimbabwe to overcome even the external macroeconomic challenges is not far-fetched. It's just the need for political will and good governance, and we can get there.
Thank you very much, both of you, for jumping on this discussion. And that wraps up this edition of the Africa Link podcast. It's good to know that there's always a way around some of the challenges being faced in different countries on the continent. So thank you very much for that. Chinai Mutambasere, development economist and DW correspondent in Harare, Columbus Mavunga.
Thank you.
Africa is changing. Don't get left behind. Tune in to Africa Link.
Now, in the short term, experts say targeted fuel subsidies, limited price controls, and social support can help cushion the blow for the most vulnerable. But over time, building foreign currency reserves and investing in alternative energy, especially solar, can reduce reliance on imported fuel. At a regional level, African countries can work together, from coordinating fuel purchases to investing in shared refining capacity and boosting intra-African trade. Because the less exposed economies are to global shocks, the better they can withstand them. Share your thoughts with us on Facebook at DW Africa. Listen on Spotify or wherever you get your podcasts. And subscribe to our DW Africa YouTube channel so you never miss an episode. This show was co-produced and edited by Isaac Mugabe, and I am Eddie Micah Jr. Thanks for listening.
DW, made for minds.